Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Campbell. I'm the CEO founder of ProfitWell. And today we're going to be talking about retention, going through a ton of data. I am under the weather here. I've been under the weather, it feels like, for 2 months now. So apologies if this sounds a little bit nasally. I'm using the fancy mic here, so hopefully that makes me sound a little bit better. But we're going to be going through a lot of information. This is pre-recorded, so there's going to be time to go back, listen to other things that I said, which makes it a little bit more nervous to record. But if you ever have any other questions or you're curious about something or you want to go deeper on something, don't be afraid to email me at pc@profitwell.com. Sometimes it takes a little bit for me to get back to you, but I eventually get back to everyone to help you out with your different retention and subscription needs. And with that, let's jump in and let me make sure I share my screen here. All right. So I changed the title a little bit, mainly because I think that the big thing I want to talk about today is outcomes and retention. And what I mean by that is when we think about what's going on within our businesses, particularly subscription businesses, but it's not just reserved strictly for subscription businesses, the number one thing that we're trying to do is get our user, get our customer to some sort of outcome. And if they get to that particular outcome, they see value in the product, inevitably they're going to stick around to the product. And the reason that we're talking about this today is because the market that we've seen, not only for the world of subscriptions and SaaS, but just the world of product in general, has changed dramatically. And unfortunately, most data indicates that we are behind when it comes to keeping up with what's happening in the market. And if we continue to do what we have been doing for retention, for pricing, and for just subscription growth in general, we're going to end up basically falling behind, and it's going to have dire consequences on your business. So we're going to unpack this today. We're going to go through a bunch of different information, like I mentioned, and it should be a pretty good time. The first thing that we're going to talk about a little bit are some current churn benchmarks, meaning where should you be? A lot of folks, when it comes to retention, they're like, yeah, it should be lower. But in actuality, there's kind of a base to where you should be depending on your industry. We're next going to talk a little bit about why fighting retention is so important right now. We're going to give you some data to basically support those arguments that you might be having internally. And then the big thing here is making sure that you actually have some good, actionable takeaways to understand what you should be doing in your business to battle retention overall. Sounds good? Everyone pumped up? I can't hear you, or I don't have a chat for feedback, but I'm assuming you're screaming excitement in your chair. Probably not, but that's okay. We'll keep rocking. So the big thing I'll mention, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, is focus on the framework. Don't focus on every little nitty gritty detail. We'll share the slides. We'll share any of the supplemental resources. We'll make sure you have everything you need to kind of get things moving, but really just kind of focus on the framework within the context of this talk right now. So just to give a little bit of context of who in God's name I am, who in God's name, the context of what I'm going to be talking about comes from. So I run a company called ProfitWell, and at ProfitWell, our target is basically producing what we like to call subscription science. And what that means is we want to understand subscription growth better than anyone else. And with that understanding, we want to produce tools that help you identify different areas of opportunities for subscription growth and actually help you with that subscription growth. And so what that means is we have a free subscription financial metrics product called ProfitWell Metrics, where you plug it into your billing system, Stripe, Zora, Braintree, ChargeBee, whatever you're using. And then essentially what we do is we give you free access to your MRR, your churn, all that kind of fun stuff. And the reason that's free is because we're able to identify opportunities for you. And then we sell products like Retain or Monetize, which is formerly called Price Intelligently, which essentially help you with your churn or help you with your pricing. And I'm giving you this context not to sell you, because that was probably the most convoluted sales pitch you've ever heard. I'm giving you this context mainly because at this point in time, we actually have about 25% of the entire subscription market using one or more of our products. And what that means is that we're now seeing inside more recurring revenue companies than anyone else out there. So it gives us a ton of context. And that's where a lot of this data is going to be coming from. And that's where, kind of the ethos is in terms of what we're actually talking about. So first up, let's get some current churn benchmarks where you should actually be. Like I kind of joked before, the answer is lower. It's always, always lower. But the thing you got to think about is that some churn is going to be okay. You're not going to be picture perfect at attracting the right customer every single time. You're not going to be picture perfect at understanding exactly what those customers need, especially if they're the wrong customers. So you're always going to have some churn, even if it's just people went out of business or can't afford your product anymore. And so it's important to understand where you should be. And so here are some benchmarks to kind of think through and actually be helpful with this. So first up, this is what churn looks like. Gross revenue churn on a monthly basis. This is what it looks like based on the age of the company. So you'll notice on the left here, companies that are less than a year old, their gross monthly churn looks anything from about 7% up to 24%. Obviously, there's a huge range there. And as a company gets older, that churn tends to go down. And this should feel pretty intuitive, right? Because as a company gets older, there's survivor bias. And obviously, a company that's been around for 10 years, presumably their churn is lower. But notice it's not absolutely zero, right? Now, if we look at some other data here, churn only... Oh, I just freaked out for a second because I thought I wasn't sharing my screen. And I was like, wow, I just went through all these slides without sharing my screen, but I think we're good. Anyways, so looking at churn based on MRR, so the actual size of the company from a revenue perspective, you'll notice that there's only a loose correlation. So as a company does get larger, you're seeing some of that survivor bias. But overall, it's one of those things where there's still some really wide ranges across the board. And so this should give you a nice little benchmark. It's blended B2B and in B2C, so both businesses as well as consumer businesses. But this gives you a little bit more of an indication. Now, when we look at this based on average revenue per user, or this is kind of based on price, there's a way you can kind of proxy this. You'll actually notice that ARPU does correlate pretty strongly with the churn rate. So if you have a $10 per month product or less, you're typically going to have much higher churn than if you're a $5,000 per month product on a monthly basis here. And this should feel pretty intuitive because if you have a $5,000 a month product, presumably you have customer success, you're selling to a very specific type of customer. And on the lower end, you're probably having very scalable, wide net marketing activities that are attracting not always the picture perfect customer. And last piece here, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, a good conversation piece, is that those companies that are funded, no matter the size of that particular company, they typically tend to have higher churn than those individuals who weren't funded. So on the far right here, you're looking at companies that are doing $1 million per month or more in recurring revenue. And you'll notice that even the funded company still has about a point, just under a point more churn per month than the non-funded company. This is just an interesting thing. It's not to say that funding is a bad thing overall, but it's a really interesting data point to kind of think through, particularly because those companies that tend to be funded, normally there's just a buy, just spend that money, spend that investment, rather than focusing on that churn and that retention early on. So just to recap here, what should you take away here? Lower ARPU definitely tends to have a higher churn battle, higher retention battle. Heavy funding will give you a false sense of security because that money will tend to hide your churn, not in all companies, but in some companies. And then lowering your churn is definitely going to be required to survive in the long term, as we saw with some of those older companies seeing much lower churn. So why is this so important? So you got some benchmarks. Why is this relevant? Why should you have listened to what I just said? And why should you listen to the rest of this conversation? Well, the big thing here is that the market is no longer your friend. I don't know who's listening to this right now, but if you're listening to this and you used to build companies 10, 20, 30 years ago, especially in the really early days of the subscription economy, you used to be able to essentially, put something out there. It wasn't necessarily great. It was great for the time, but we would look at it and think of it as primitive. And it used to do really well because there just wasn't a lot of competition out back then. And the products, the barrier to putting out a product was so big technologically that once you got something out there, it could tend to do fairly well. The thing is, though, is that us as businesses, we've lost a lot of our power because of what's happening in the market. And what I mean by that is if you think about the number of competitors that are now exist, it's actually risen pretty dramatically. The data you're looking at right now are the number of competitors that a company had in their first year in business. And you'll notice that those companies that started 5 years ago, they had just under 3 competitors on average. And those folks who started about a year ago, or in this case, about 2 years ago, given when the data was collected, they had just under 10 competitors. And what's kind of fascinating is that this competitive map gives us the most overused marketing slide in any slide deck out there, which is the MarTech landscape here, where this is every single company that is a marketing technology company that's focused on trying to make you grow. Every H1 on these websites focuses on your growth. And this MarTech landscape, 4 or 5 years before this particular snapshot, it actually only had about 400 to 500 companies. So again, this should feel intuitive. There's a lot more product out there. It's easier and easier to build product. It's never going to be easy to build a great product. But if we all wanted to start a business by the end of this talk, we could spin up a server, we could get GitHub moving, we could get a whole bunch of things moving where we could actually get a website even up, and all of a sudden we could call ourselves a company, right? There's just a lot more noise out there. And what that's meant is that our customer acquisition cost has actually increased pretty dramatically. What you're looking at here is in both B2B and in B2C, essentially the growth of your customer acquisition cost. And what you'll notice is that that company or that customer that you might have acquired for, let's say, $100 5 years ago, that customer is actually now costing you about $160 to $165 today. And this should feel intuitive as well, because everyone and their mother has an ebook. Everyone's got PPC ads. There's just a whole host of things happening with all types of different companies out there and all types of different advertising. Now, the impact of this and all of this competition has also meant that we're getting hit on the other side as well, where a lot of us are saying, hey, it's okay, there's competition. There's so much out there. Let's just build really high value features. The problem is that the relative value of features is declining. Because there's so much more software out there, so much more product out there, what we're noticing is that not only in core features, but also in all those different add-ons we used to do to boost actual willingness to pay, basically those aren't worth as much anymore. Just to give you some context, that Salesforce integration you might have sold for, let's say, $1,000 per month 5 years ago, it's now worth only about 30% of its once value, mainly because everyone and their mother has a Salesforce integration. It's just something that's expected from your customers. And to kind of make matters worse even further, what we've noticed is that switching costs are actually very, very easy now. It's very, very easy to switch product. What you're looking at here in this data is basically the time it took to fully onboard a product in an organization. So about 10 years ago, it took about 57 hours to fully onboard a product inside an organization because you had perpetual licenses with on-premise software, all types of stuff going on. And today, it's taking less than 7 hours to onboard a product. And for most of us, it might take minutes because we just sign up with some sort of SaaS web app offering. And to kind of give the final, gut punch here, a lot of us then go, we want more customers. The issue is that acquisition is now table stakes. And what I mean by this is because we used to be in this golden age of growing a business where it was just this gold rush of just acquiring more and more customers. The problem is that gold rush has ended because everyone realized there was a gold rush, very similar to what happened in 1849 within the Western United States. And to illustrate this, we built a little bit model that we've been working on for a couple of years now. And basically what we found is that if you break down each of the pillars of growth in your business, so acquisition, monetization, and retention, acquiring a customer, monetizing them, and retaining them, what we actually found is that if you increase your acquisition by about 1%, and this is on the left-hand side here, by 1%, meaning your net new leads, meaning your conversion volume, you'll typically see about a 2% boost in your bottom line, and that's down from about a 3% boost in your bottom line about 5-6 years ago. Now, if we improve our monetization, our ARPU by 1%, or we improve our retention by 1%, we're not only seeing much, much higher gains, 16% for monetization, almost 10% for retention, but that gain is actually accelerating over time, mainly because that growth has to come from somewhere. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we're probably putting most of our expenses, most of our time in the first bucket, acquisition, and spending very, very little time in monetization and retention, which is why we're talking about today. And just as another little side note, I think a lot of people react to a lot of this data and they're like, that's fine. We're going to continue what we're doing and we're just going to make everyone so happy. The issue is, from a customer satisfaction standpoint, is that there's so much product out there and there's so much going on that our customers have become somewhat ungrateful. And this is measured through Net Promoter Score, NPS, where we've seen that the average Net Promoter Score, the average customer satisfaction rating, has actually come down quite substantially. So it was about 34 5 years ago, and it's a scale of -100 to 100. And now it's about 10 about a year ago or about 2 years ago. And what's scary about this is I don't think anyone's going to comment below or comment and send me an email and say, hey, products are so much better like 10 years ago, 5 years ago than they are today. It's actually the inverse, but we're actually more unhappy because we're just expecting things. Software isn't as magical as it once was. And so I'm sure everyone's a little unhappy and probably hit pause or stop on this because this is all upsetting. But the thing to kind of keep in mind, your customer acquisition costs, your competition's up, the willingness to pay, the technical moats that we once had, NPS is all down. A lot of this is completely out of our control because, we can't control that part of the market. And our eternal focus on acquisition is fundamentally broken as an actual growth lever, mainly because it's starting to become table stakes. Growth is coming from monetization and retention-based activities. And that doesn't mean you don't need acquisition. You're probably still going to spend the most amount of money on acquisition, but it does mean you need to take a step back and spend some of the time on these other two big growth levers. So how do we do that? Well, when it comes to retention, the big thing to keep in mind is that retention is a math formula. And I know that some of you are rolling your eyes and you're like, oh, math. I didn't want to do that since I left college. But let's talk through it a little bit because it's actually pretty straightforward. Because retention is a game of inches. And what I mean by these two statements is that there are little things that you can do on every single piece of retention that actually influence your net retention overall. And a lot of us, we take a step back and we think, oh my God, there's this big daunting thing of handling churn. When we just break down the problem, it actually becomes a lot easier to actually manage. And so when we look at churn, we have three really, really big parts. We have our delinquent churn. So these are credit card failures, and these are non-payments if you have invoices. We have active churn, which is essentially people who are saying, nope, I want to cancel. I'm going to check this box off. I'm going to actually cancel my subscription. And then finally, we have expansion revenue. So these are people who say, hey, I'm buying this much product. I want to buy more of the product, or I want to use more of the product. And notice that your active churn and your delinquent churn, this is known as your gross churn. So this is always going to be negative unless it's zero, right? And then your expansion revenue, it can overcome that gross churn and even add more. And this is what we get to net negative churn or greater than 100% retention. So once we break this down, we start to realize that there's different things that influence each of these three main parts. So we have our active churn, we have our expansion revenue, and we have our delinquencies. Now, what's kind of cool is that the first thing you got to do is you got to track this information. Now, this is ProfitWell. We do show this data for free once you hook up your billing system, and you can see all of your retention figures in nice detail. But it doesn't matter. You can use ProfitWell. You can use some of our competitors. Ours are free and we think they're better, but that's okay. It's important to just do something. It's okay if you have a spreadsheet, if you're using something really, really fancy. All of that's totally fine, but you got to know where you are for these three main buckets. And the reason is because some of you, your gross churn, especially your cancellations, might be really, really low. And if it's low, you shouldn't be spending time on that active churn, because the biggest bucket that you should have is maybe your delinquent churn, or maybe you need to do your expansion revenue. That's why it's so important to understand where you stand. Because a lot of us, again, we approach churn as this big thing, this big scary thing that we need to attack, when in reality, it's a big and scary thing, but there's a lot of little parts that we need to attack. So you have to know which part to attack. So you got to know your numbers up front. Then all of a sudden, we have these different pieces that make up all of these main pieces. So things that influence active churn are your features, the time to value you have. Do you have the right buyers coming into your business? Is the branding right? Things that influence expansion are your value metric, are the packaging that you have. And then of course, delinquencies, which is kind of its own separate thing, is the amount of people that are canceling their credit cards. Now, when we break these main pieces down, what we tend to find, as you're seeing on the slide here, is that some of these things are a little bit easier than others. So understanding exactly the type of buyer that you should be targeting, or the features that you should be offering up these folks, that takes some heavy research. That is not a very small inch. That's a very large inch to kind of continue the turn of phrase. Particularly because it's not just, hey, we're selling to developers. It's we're selling to this size developers who use this particular framework and this particular coding language and have this detail and this detail. Because that's how you make sure you're getting the right type of buyers. But there's other things here that are much more tactical. So your time to value, you can show your time to value to these customers in a lot of different ways. Your expansion revenue, that's something that can be very, very tactical within your business. Your delinquencies, it's pure tactics in order to reduce those delinquencies. And then there's other things here that take just an enormous amount of time. So developing your brand, this isn't something that you can just go, hey, we should develop our brand. Let's finish that next week. It's something that's just going to take it's going to take just a ton of time over time in order to really develop that brand. But once we start breaking down these individual pieces, we can start to move and influence these levers. And the levers that you have, they're going to cover basically what I just outlined, but they might just be a little bit different for each of your businesses. And so we're going to approach some of these levers in a little bit more in depth so you can kind of exploit these particular levers within your business. So the first thing, features and buyers. And this is probably the hardest one in terms of research, because it not only just takes time, but it also takes effort. And a lot of you probably don't want to put in all of the effort because we're always looking for that silver bullet, which if I had it, I'd give it to you or at least sell it to you. But this is really the silver bullet. It just unfortunately takes some time. And that's identifying what features your buyers care about. And the reason that I find this really, really important is because what I have found is that a lot of us aren't talking to our customers in a research capacity, at least. The data you're looking at here is we asked a bunch of different companies from Johnny and Jane's startup all the way up to Fortune 500 companies. Hey, how often are you talking to your customers in a non-sales capacity? How many conversations are you having per month? And what we found is that most of us are talking to less than 10 individuals a month in a research capacity. And a lot of product people will tell me, listen, Patrick, we don't talk to our customers, but we absolutely do A/B and multivariate testing. Well, the data suggests that we aren't doing that either, right? So if you're not doing research and you're not doing testing, all of a sudden we're in this predicament of, well, how are you understanding what to build and how are you understanding who to target? And the reason that this is so important is because a lot of us are building the wrong product. And to illustrate this, I have to introduce a new model, which we've gone into detail. We have a bunch of data on this that I'm more than willing to share and a bunch of methodologies on how you can produce the same model for your business. But I want to introduce it because it illustrates this point very, very beautifully. And in order to do that, we have to talk about how to think about value in a product. Now, when you think of a product, and it doesn't matter if it's a piece of software, if it's a cup of coffee, or anything in between, you have two axes of value. The first axis of value is the relative value of the actual attributes of that piece. So for a cup of coffee, it'd be like the taste, the country of origin, the temperature, etc. The other axis of value is the willingness to pay. So what I can do is I can survey the entire audience on this particular webinar, and then I can go talk to the entire city of Boston where we're based, or the entire US. I can talk to a particular segment or group, and I can find out using some methodologies that we've developed that most people, not all people, but most people, the number one thing they care about is taste, and then they're pretty indifferent about temperature. And their least important, not completely unimportant, but their least important feature relative to the other features is the country of origin. Now, using another methodology, I can figure out the willingness to pay of these individuals. And then what I can do is I can find out that those individuals who care about taste, they're willing to pay about 25 to 30% more as the other folks within the survey sample. Those people who care about temperature, they're willing to pay about 20% less. And those hipsters in the room who care about country of origin, there's not a lot of them, but those few, they do have a willingness to pay that's about 35 to 40%. Now, if I find a feature that is really, really high value from a relative value against all the other features, and also has high willingness to pay, then that is a differentiable feature. Now, if I find a feature that has low value from a relative feature perspective and has high willingness to pay, that's an add-on. Something that's high value, low willingness to pay is a core feature. And then something that's low value and low willingness to pay is trash. Now, we went out and we talked to about 1,300 product leaders and we asked them about their last N features. We introduced this model and we said, for your last however many features you want, where do they fall on this quadrant? And what we found is that this is what they said for just under 5,000 features. A lot of really high differentiable features, some add-ons, some insecure folks thinks that they're building some trash. But what's kind of fascinating about this is that we then went out to about 1.5 million different customers of these products. And using our methodologies, we collected this data, and this is what the customers said. And just to give that a little dramatic effect, This is what we think we're building. And this is what our customers think we're building. So there's a really, really big disconnect. And this is happening because of what's happening in the market and because we don't understand our buyers. So Grandpa HubSpot, Grandma Marketo talked about buyer personas 10 years ago, right? And buyer personas in and of themselves are not great because you have to understand those buyers on a much deeper level than developers. You have to understand, what do they care about? What do they not care about? What is their lifetime value? What is the job that they're trying to do with that product? There's so many deeper things that you need to understand in order to build the right product. And we're not going to get super deep into doing this research. More than happy to share some of the books we've written, can definitely share some other resources from some other folks as well. But the most important thing is to understand these buyers on a much, much deeper level. And unfortunately, that takes work. And I know that all of you are like, oh, we have to do a bunch of work. Well, I guarantee you, this is the number one difference between companies that are doing really, really well with their retention and companies that aren't doing that well. It's the companies that are doing well understand their buyers just cold. They know the details of their buyers. They know where to find them. They know their detail, all of the detail that they need. Whereas most companies that I go into that have a problem with retention, the answer is, oh, developers, that's who we sell to, right? This does take some work. It has insanely, insanely high impact. Now, let's get some tactical things because I think I want you guys to leave with something that you can use right away within your business. And the first thing is helping people see time to value. So there's a lot of really, really good stuff out there. The AppQ's crew, the Mixpanel crew, they all talk about making sure that that product experience for your users is really, really good. But there's some other things that you can do within your business to make sure that that customer sees the time to value very, very quickly. The first is around your onboarding. And a lot of folks, we don't spend a ton of time on our onboarding because we're like, yeah, we like know this product's valuable. Like just dump them in there, see how they do, right? Well, the thing is what we found is that when you can actually understand on a buyer by buyer basis what features are important to those types of segments, and then using AppQs or another product like it, you can then segment that user experience for those particular buyers. Retention essentially goes up because you're getting that user to see that value in your product as soon as humanly possible. Other ways you can actually do this is by using implementation and training fees and an implementation and training kind of markup for your product. And I know this sounds a little bit counterintuitive because you're worried about, oh my gosh, we're going to reduce our conversion. But sometimes a little bit of a reduction in conversion, and it's actually a very, very small amount that we found in the data, can actually influence your retention in a really, really big way. So what you're looking at here is you have 4 sets of twos. So on the really far right, your first set of 2, you have a B2C product and a B2B product, or a cohort of products. And those products have ARPU, average revenue per user, from $1 to $100. And then all the way on the far right, you have a B2C cohort and a B2B cohort where the products are $1,000 a month on average or more. And what you'll notice and what you're looking at is essentially what is the relative net retention of these companies who are using implementation fees. And you'll notice that all of these are over 0%. So to put that in layman's term, on the far left here, both B2C and in B2B, when they had an implementation and training fee, they had 10 to 13% on average better retention than those companies who didn't have an implementation and training fee. On the far right, it's 17 to about 22%. And I'm talking about the medians here for both B2C and in B2B. And this should feel pretty intuitive, right? Because instead of having to nail that product experience and get everything picture perfect, you're adding a little bit more friction. So they probably talk to human beings. They get trained. They get pointed out what's good, what's bad. And inevitably what happens is they just see the product in a better light, and you can in field and answer any of those questions and actually train them on the product. And you see folks like HubSpot do this all the time, where you have to go through training on how to use the product before you actually are allowed into the product and you're allowed to just fully buy the product, which is pretty cool. Now, some other really tactical things that you can do to reduce or increase your retention and reduce your churn: force or optimize annual payments. Now, I understand that some of you aren't going to be able to do this completely, but what's kind of cool is that annual contracts, they correlate with much, much lower churn. And this should also feel intuitive because for an annual contract, someone has to pay once versus a 12-month contract where they're reminded and have to make a decision on purchasing 12 different times within a year. And you'll notice on the far left here, these are companies that have 0% of their contracts as annuals or longer term. Their churn is about 10% on a median basis. All the way on the right here, those folks who have 75 to 100% of their contracts as annual contracts, their churn is around 2.5%. So some of you, it's not something where you can force all annual contracts like some higher ARPU products would be, but you certainly can adjust that particular flow, because most of us, the only time we're asking for an annual payment is upfront, which is probably not the best time to do it, or maybe once a year when we remember for the end of year budget dump. Another big thing here, and this is a mix of tactical and a mix of something that takes a little bit work, is to use what's called a value metric. So a value metric is what you charge for. It's per user, per 100 visits, per 1,000 videos. And what you're seeing here is that different businesses targeting similar customers can actually utilize different types of value metrics. So we're looking at Intercom here, which actually prices based on the number of people flowing through the particular product. So the reason that Intercom's doing this, or they were doing this, I believe they just changed this actually, is because they're targeting support people, they're targeting sales people, they're targeting marketing people, they're targeting all types of different people. And that allows them to basically get folks within the market to come to this more generalized pricing. Now, another competitor of theirs, Drift, that targets salespeople more than anyone, notice how their pricing does have a contacts or a number of people element to it, but their main value metric is the number of seats that are within the actual product. And so what's interesting is that, again, two very, very similar products serving a little bit different markets, and essentially they're able to use different value metrics because of the market that they're targeting. Now, the reason that value metrics are so important is because when someone pays for the exact value that they're getting, you avoid the problem of charging Disney the same price as you're charging Johnny and Jane Startup, but you also are able to reduce churn, because if people value what they're paying for and they're paying for that extra value or paying less for that less value, all of a sudden there's no reason to churn because that value equilibrium actually exists. And just to give you some data here, what you're looking at is gross churn across different pricing models. And you'll notice on the left that feature differentiated products have much, much higher churn, almost double the churn as on the right here, where people who have single or multiple value metrics. And again, this is because people are just paying for what they're getting rather than, having to decide, hey, do I need that feature? Do I not need that feature? They're making sure that they can actually attack the right piece of their retention. Another piece here is your brand and your support. These take a little bit time to get right, but they do require some investment. What's kind of cool is that your brand matters now. What you're looking at here is retention based on the perception of brand from a particular customer. So the top line here, you're basically looking at people who have a positive perception of a brand. The bottom line is negative perception. And we grouped a bunch of different products together. And it's about 33,000 different consumers of different subscription products. And what you'll notice is that those people have a positive perception of a brand. They have about 20% higher retention than those who have a negative perception. And about 5 to 10 years ago, the data we were able to get actually showed that this was much flatter, meaning that that 20% gain actually really didn't exist. Now we're in a world where it's actually much, much more important to have a good brand because there's just so many other products out there. Support follows a similar kind of model where you're looking at here the same type of analysis, but now it's based on the perception of support. So the top line here is, do they perceive the support in a positive light? The bottom line here is, do they perceive it in a negative light? And again, you're looking at a 15 to 20% higher retention, net retention for those companies that are essentially have positive perceptions of their support versus those who have negative perceptions. But both of those things take a little bit of time. But if you're already investing in these things, might be time to kind of invest in them a little bit more, or just know that that's not an area where you need to invest any more in because you're already probably gaining those gains. And then finally, one of the most mechanical things you can do to help with your retention is really around your delinquencies. So delinquencies are when a credit card fails or a payment fails. There's 130 plus different reasons why a credit card fails. We've analyzed the metadata from like 800 million credit cards at this point. And so I've learned more about credit cards than I think I've ever wanted to in my life. But there's a lot of reasons that these things fail. And what's kind of interesting about this is that your delinquencies, especially for a company that relies on credit cards for payments, they account for about 20 to 40% of your overall churn. So what we found is it's the largest single bucket of churn. And what's kind of cool about it is that what we've noticed, or this is not cool, I should say, but it's an interesting thing that we found, is that as the company gets bigger, so what you're looking at here is different groups of company sizes. So on the far right here are companies that are doing 50 million a year or more. As a company gets bigger, that bucket becomes larger, mainly because you're not getting economies of scale. You're not getting economies of scale by having more credit cards. And unfortunately, the average recovery rates are actually pretty bad. So in both B2B and in B2C, we're really only looking at about 30, maybe 35% of these folks coming back. So what that means is that if 10 people go delinquent, you're only recovering about 3 to 4 of those folks. So if 10 people's credit card fails, only 3 or 4 are coming back. And we want to really see this in the 7 to 8, 70 to 80% range, because there are going to be some people who drop off just as an excuse, but really you should be clearing 70 to 80% in terms of recovery rate. So some of the things that you can kind of attack with this are making sure that you have really, really good dunning, meaning good emails, doing in-app messaging, making sure that you have some sort of smart retries on, because really only 1 out of 5 of these folks is legit churn, and you want to try to get as many of that 4 out of 5 back as you can. So I got more information on that, more than happy to share. Just that's a whole deck probably that we could go through, but that's probably one of the deepest tactical pieces that you can look at right now, because most of you probably haven't optimized there. And the secret is really just treating those folks as their own marketing channel. So to recap, you got to know your numbers, because that's the only place that you're going to be able to know, hey, where should I help? Where do I need help? Excuse me. You can use ProfitWell. You can use a whole host of other resources that are out there, but you got to know your numbers. And then finally, you want to attack your churn and retention in the proper order. And the proper order really comes down to your own business. So if I was a really large business, I probably would have multiple teams on different areas of retention. If I'm a small business, I might have to take the biggest one that I can that's not going to take a ton of time, which might be delinquencies and some of these other pieces. Really, if I'm a really early stage business, I probably want to attack some of the harder pieces like my buyers and my features, because those are the things that are going to be really, really important. And you don't want to get to a later stage and then try to solve churn, because it just gets a lot more complicated. So with that, we do offer free retention audits. So if you hook onto ProfitWell, we're able to tell you where you are based on similar types of companies. We can actually give you grades based on like, hey, your delinquencies are here. They're really good compared to the rest of the market, or they're really bad compared to the rest of the market. So you can go to ProfitWell.com /audit, or just feel free to email me at pc@profitwell.com. I am more than happy to help, even if it's just advice, or even if it's just passing along a particular blog post or something that we wrote. We published tons of data on all of these different elements. So I'm more than happy to help. And with that, I think this goes back to my face now, hopefully here. There we go. And with that, thank you so much. This was enjoyable, although it's not live. So if you do have any questions, it's just pc@profitwell.com. Love to talk about this stuff. And so, yeah, just let me know your questions and we'll rock out from there. Thanks, everybody.